Um, a very good morning to everyone, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, on behalf of CSIS, I'd like to welcome you all to this lecture series on regional dynamics that we hold regularly whenever there is a prominent scholars or individuals visiting Jakarta or from Jakarta. And today we are very honored to have our own Ambassador Rizal Sukma. It's weird to introduce him in this building, but I have to go through the protocoler because he's now government official. Not part of the think tank, but he'll be back for sure very soon to Indonesia. Dr. Rizal Sukma is the Indonesian ambassador to the United Kingdom, Ireland, and the International Maritime Organization. He's also, as you all know, former executive director of CSIS, member of the board of advisors of the Institute for Peace and Democracy, or IPD. Since receiving his PhD in international relations from the London School of Economics and Political Science in 1997, Ambassador Sukma has worked extensively on such issues as wide as Southeast Asian security, ASEAN, Indonesia's defense and foreign policy, military reform, Islam and politics, as well as domestic political changes in Indonesia. So he might fit any position in the government, hopefully. Ambassador Sukma has served as a member of the National Committee on Strategic Defense Review at the Ministry of Defense of the Republic of Indonesia. He was also a member of the National Drafting Committee for the National Defense Bill 2000-2002 and the Armed Forces Bill 2002 and 2003. He was the first Indonesian to receive the Nakasone Award from the from Japan in July 2005, and named one of 100 global thinkers in 2009 by Foreign Policy magazine. With that introduction, I'd like to welcome Ambassador Sukma to deliver his public lecture. The floor is yours, Lord.
Thank you, Philip. A very good morning to all of you. Of course, it's always difficult to say no, whenever CSIS asks you to deliver either a talk or speech, but this is the first time, actually to deliver a public lecture. So that's why I have to write, a paper. The other reason is that as a government officials, I'm not really free. I lost my freedom since January 2016. So that's why, after I said yes to Philip's invitations, I immediately regretted it, simply because this is the building that, has great impact on my personal scholarly developments. Since I started, my career as a researcher in June 1990, immediately after I completed my bachelor's degree in Bandung. So it really, gave me a great dilemma, to be here and to deliver this speech. On the one hand, this is the place where I learn and evolve, as a policy analyst and a scholar, for more than 26 years. This is the place that taught me, as a scholar, I should never hesitate to speak my mind, as a reflection of an academic integrity and also as the reflection of an academic coherence. This is the important lessons that I learned from Pak Yusuf Wanandi, to which I would like to actually express my thanks. He's a great mentor and also an academic father to me. And by the way, he is a Sumatran. He's from Sumatra, so that's why he kept telling me, just speak whatever you think. And then I realized, an ambassador, I have to think before I speak. On the other hand, I also realized, as someone holding a public position, as an official of the state, there are certain limits and ethics that I am expected to observe. And that requires a delicate skill of being frank, but in a way that will not hurt other people's feeling. So for this skill, I would like to thank Ibu Clara Yuwono. She's also my mentor and academic, sister. And because of she's from Java, she asked me, to be polite and then observe, certain degree of ethics. But I'm not sure, whether, I have fully mastered, that skill, being frank but not offending people. So I find it's very hard. And she's a master, in that being frank, but, she doesn't offend people. On the other hand, from Pak Yusuf, I learned, if you need to offend people, just do it, man. So, Phillips, had you invited me to give this lecture 1 or 2 years ago, I would have given you the official version, of the topics, which is Indo-Pacific. But, as I will be in my current jobs for only a few more months, at least I hope, so I will try to approach my lecture today, from both official and the academic perspective. I will be frank whenever I must, and will be normative and boring whenever I should. So this is why I have to stick to this, written text in front of me. So, if some people get offended with what I'm going to say in this lecture, so I'm confident that Pak Yusuf and Ibu Clara, will welcome me back, into this building as a senior research fellow. This is the best job, in the world, because what you have to do is only read, write, and then travel to deliver the papers in many conferences, around the world. So this is the position that I'm really longing to return to once I complete my duty, in London. So let me begin by reminding all of us that during the 31st of the ASEAN, summit in late June 2019 in Bangkok, ASEAN leaders officially endorsed and adopted the ASEAN Outlook on Indo-Pacific. So they agreed, in light of the ongoing strategic changes in the regions, that ASEAN needs its own visions about the future of regional order, visions that represents a distinct ASEAN's view and voice. ASEAN leaders hope that the visions would reconcile the competing visions of regional order advocated by major powers. By adopting the outlook, ASEAN evidently wants to remind itself and sends a very simple message to extra-regional powers that ASEAN centrality should never be forgotten. So indeed, one of the ASEAN's remarkable qualities since its inception in 1967 has been its ability to survive power play among the great powers. So yet, as we enter the third decade of the 21st century, the strategic challenges facing ASEAN are different from the past. Different challenges, of course, require different responses. So during the Cold War era, for example, ASEAN, still 5 members at a time, believed that it could preserve regional peace and stability by trying to keep great power rivalries out of the regions. Zofan is a clear example of this approach. When the Cold War ended, new strategic context compelled ASEAN to open up and embrace extra-regional powers as a strategy in maintaining peace and stability in the regions. This is demonstrated by the proliferations of ASEAN-centered multilateral processes and platforms such as the ASEAN Regional Forum, the APT, the ASEAN Plus 3, the ADMM Plus, the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Plus, and also the East Asia Summit. So the short-lived unipolar moment allowed ASEAN to focus more on deeper institutionalizations and the regional community building project. So ASEAN managed to have the ASEAN Charter and agreed on a blueprint to transform itself into an ASEAN community. And today ASEAN finds itself in a completely new terrain. The world is undergoing profound changes. Scholars and policymakers start to talk about the world in disarray, disorder, and even anarchy. So we live in a turbulent world where the old is being dismantled and the new is yet to emerge. Power relations and balance of power are shifting. New rivalry is emerging and the old ones are returning. So allies are changing side, friends become foes, and foes become friends. So indeed, we live in a world characterized by the great uncertainty, and we have no idea what to expect. So faced with such strategic uncertainty, every nation is scrambling and struggling to find the most suitable place for itself in the emerging strategic environment, individually, unilaterally, or collectively. So within that context, some of us in Indonesia began to worry about the peace and stability in Southeast Asia, about the future of ASEAN, about the future of the entire East Asia, and more importantly, about Indonesia's place in the emerging regional order. So we know the geoeconomics and geopolitical center of gravity of the world is shifting from west to east. We already know China is fast becoming a great power, if not already is. So we also know that the US is trying to sustain its primacy in the world while dismantling the international order it helped to build since 1945. So yet the process of that strategic change is still unraveling, and the final outcome of those changes remain to be seen. Three developments, however, have emerged from the process of change. First, a great power game is returning to Southeast Asia. Second, the future of Southeast Asia is increasingly defined by how extra-regional powers interact with each other. And third, extra-regional powers begin to formulate and promote their own vision of regional order. So the key questions before us in this region, therefore, are twofold. One, are we about to see the end of the ASEAN-centered regional order and enter what I call the post-ASEAN regional order? And second, what are we going to do about it? So in principle, the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific is an attempt to provide answers to those questions. So the ASEAN Outlook recognizes it is interest, this is, I quote, from the 5 pages document, it is in the interest of ASEAN to lead the shaping of their economic and security architecture in order to address challenges stemming from changes in the Asia-Pacific and Indian Ocean regions. So in doing so, the Outlook also promised that ASEAN will, quote, continue to maintain its central role in the evolving regional architecture in Southeast Asia and its surrounding regions, and continue being an honest broker within the strategic environment of competing interests, unquote. So this is the key rationale, behind the Indonesia's Indo-Pacific proposals, to ASEAN since early 2018, starting here, I think in this building, CSIS, when the Foreign Minister Retno Marsudi gave a major policy speech, on the 16th of May, 2018, on this issue. So the Outlook, in this sense, constitutes a response to the growing challenge stemming from external pressure that could threaten ASEAN unity, undermine ASEAN's relevance, and corrode, ASEAN centrality. And responding to external changes at critical times is something ASEAN has always been good at. So, seen in this light, the Outlook is a strategic necessity. So ASEAN can no longer just sit and watch, watch extra-regional powers actively shape the future of our own regions. ASEAN must ensure that its two core interests, ASEAN centrality and the strategic autonomy of the region, will be preserved, enhanced, and reinforced. ASEAN hopes that the Outlook would provide the necessary platform to do that. So it is necessary to point out that the Outlook would not have been possible without Indonesia's initiative and determination. So under the leadership and direct involvement of Foreign Minister Retno Marsudi, Indonesia managed to convince its regional partners that it is a strategic necessity for ASEAN to articulate its own visions on the future of regional order and architecture. And Indonesia hopes and expects that the Outlook to address strategic challenges in the regions and give impetus for greater regional cooperation. So in strategic terms, it hopes the Outlook could serve as a platform through which rivalries among great powers can be mitigated and conflict prevented. Indonesia also hopes that the Outlook can serve as an inclusive meeting place for the competing visions of regional order offered by great and regional players. And most importantly, it expects to maintain ASEAN's relevance, upholds ASEAN centrality, preserve ASEAN unity, and sustain Southeast Asia's strategic autonomy. Anyone notice there is one word that I keep repeating over the last, I think 3 pages of the page? Hope. Indonesia hope, ASEAN expect, Indonesia hope, ASEAN expect. So now let's move from hope and expectation to policy and strategy. So this is where the challenge, I think becomes more profound. Why? Because the burden and responsibility, of moving from hope to policy, from expectation to strategy, rests first and foremost with Indonesia. And our ability to fulfill that task would require an understanding of the domestic origins of the Indonesian Indo-Pacific outlook. And that understanding would not be complete unless we also understand the return of maritime awareness into Indonesia's strategic thinking. So this is a topic that Bang Rene is very fond of. 5 years ago, on the 20th of October 2014, in his inaugural speech, President Jokowi declared, "We have to work hard to rebuild Indonesia as a maritime nation. We have far too long turned our back on the seas, the oceans, the straits, and the bays. It is time to turn everything around so that in the sea we will triumph. Jalas Veva Jaya Mahe." It's a very simple proclamation, yet it carries a very powerful message. It reminds all Indonesians that we were once a maritime power. It declares that it is now our duty to reclaim that identity. So the speech marks the beginning of a new path, for a new Indonesia, an Indonesia as maritime power. So at this point, really, I'm really tempted to evaluate, whether we are still on that path, or not. But I will leave that assessment until I'm no longer on the payroll of the government. So President Jokowi's inaugural speech is a continuation, of the ideas that had formed the core argument of his opening remarks during a presidential debate on foreign policy and defense earlier that year. So if elected, he pledged to transform Indonesia into a global maritime fulcrum, a power between two strategic oceans. So this idea was then articulated in greater details at the 9th East Asia Summit in Myanmar in November 2014. In his speech, President Jokowi clearly explains how Indonesia would transform itself into a global maritime fulcrum by focusing on 5 pillars of the GMF. One is maritime culture, second, maritime resources, and then maritime infrastructure and connectivity, and then fourth, maritime diplomacy, maritime safety and security. But that 5 pillars now has been expanded, into, I think 7 or 9, 7 pillars, which include, the human resources development, marine-related area, and also, I think, maritime space. But the core is really the 5 that I just mentioned. So transforming Indonesia into the global maritime fulcrum cannot be achieved in a vacuum. We must take into account the strategic changes taking place in our external environment. And given the nature of international changes I mentioned earlier, it is imperative for Indonesia to undertake a strategic repositioning. So the GMF provides a conceptual framework for Indonesia to do just that. So first, GMF reflects a very simple understanding. The way you define the map and where you are on that map will define how you behave internationally. That is basically the basic premise, principle of the global maritime fulcrum. So here, when you look at the map, Indonesia is clearly located between the two strategic oceans, the Indian and Pacific Oceans. In this context, the GMF is about positioning Indonesia as a fulcrum between the two oceans. It is also about strategic outlook that recognize the paramount importance of maritime domain in our foreign policy. Second, as a doctrine, the GMF emphasized geographical, geopolitical, and also geoeconomic reality of Indonesia, whose future depends on and will affect the dynamics of the Pacific and the Indian Oceans. Therefore, for Indonesia to only pay attention to the Pacific Oceans would no longer make any strategic sense. So given these two features of the GMF, then it would make a lot of sense for Indonesia to expand its space of engagement, or mandala. So therefore, Indonesia needs to reconceptualize and reconstruct the geopolitical and geoeconomic space for itself. Treating the Indo-Pacific region as a single geopolitical and geoeconomic theater is the answer for that need. In other words, for Indonesia, articulating its vision for the Indo-Pacific is a logical outcome of the need to operationalize the global maritime fulcrum as a foreign policy doctrine. So seen in this light, Indonesia's embrace of the Indo-Pacific idea is a foreign policy operationalization of a national maritime vision. So this is why the burden and responsibility of moving from hope to policy, from expectation to strategy, rests first and foremost with Indonesia. So as the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific originates from Indonesia, then of course logical to expect that Indonesia would continue to take the lead, in ensuring that the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific does what it is meant to do. So the question is, what should we do next? I have explained earlier that why the reconceptualizations of the regional order, the Indo-Pacific, is a strategic necessity for Indonesia and also for ASEAN. So now we need to ensure that the ASEAN Outlook is not another exercise in norms setting. In its current form, the ASEAN Outlook on Indo-Pacific provides a set of principles and rules, even though it also includes a set of recommendations on areas of cooperation. So, but please don't get me wrong. I love norms. Norms are important. So I do believe that without norms, states will be governed by Hobbesian law of bellum omnium contra omnes, or the war of all against all. Without norms, interstate relations will be dictated by Morgenthal's hierarchy of physical powers among nations. Without norms, international relations will be defined by Thucydides' maxim of the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. So however, the current challenges dictate us to also realize that we can no longer just cling to the idea that norms alone can define how states, especially great powers, behave toward each other. The era of relying exclusively on norm setting has long passed. So we now need to follow through those norms with a very clear and with clear-headed thinking on what to do next in a much more realistic and pragmatic way. So Indonesia under President Jokowi is now trying to balance past preference for norm setting, norm building, which we are all quite familiar and very convenient with that task, with a more action-oriented, more realist, interest-driven initiative in foreign policy. So this points to two imperatives for Indonesia. First, it is imperative for Indonesia to continue implementing the GMF agenda comprehensively. And second, it is also imperative for Indonesia to continue driving the discussions within ASEAN on a common policy and strategy to navigate the Indo-Pacific. So with regards to the first requirements, 5 clusters of actions are in order. First, we must reclaim and revive our maritime culture and identity. Indonesia understands that its identity, prosperity, and also its future depend on how we manage the oceans. We must learn, relearn, and unlearn everything about the sea. So we should teach our children that the sea is not a mystery, but an opportunity. Second, we must secure, utilize, and preserve our maritime resources. Our maritime resources is first and foremost for all Indonesians to enjoy. Yet we also realize that the sea is a global public good, and we must work with the international community to ensure that the ocean stays that way. Third, we must develop our maritime infrastructure and connectivity. This is why we continue to focus on building sea highways, deep sea ports, logistics, shipbuildings, and maritime tourism. These priorities will transform Indonesia into a truly archipelagic state, united, not divided by the sea. Fourth, we must work with our partners within the Pacific and the Indian Ocean around the world. We must conduct a maritime-oriented foreign policy and diplomacy. We should start drawing a coherent plan on how we will play our role in our new space of engagement. So the Indo-Pacific, that's become the new space of engagement for Indonesia, the new mandala in our foreign policy. So we need an Indo-Pacific strategy, a strategy that elevates the place of maritime element in our foreign policy thinking and incorporates the GMF pillars into diplomatic conduct. And this is the subject that I really want to develop later once I get back to CSIS Buklara. I don't have time at the moment because I'm still busy trying to sell streams and also coffee and kusen. What is kusen? The window frame. So we can sell that in the UK. Fifth, as a fulcrum of the two strategic oceans, Indonesia must develop and strengthen its maritime defense capability. We need to do this, not only to defend our sovereignty and secure our maritime resources, but also to fulfill our responsibility in ensuring safety of navigation and maritime security in the regions. So with regard to the second requirement that I mentioned earlier, there are 5 key issues that Indonesia might want to consider. First, Indonesia should continue to encourage ASEAN to provide a greater strategic clarity to its Indo-Pacific outlook. So this should begin by articulating clearly what function the ASEAN Outlook on Indo-Pacific should serve. Strategic ambiguity, while sometimes necessary, might not always help ASEAN in preserving its strategic relevance. So for example, ASEAN leaders stated that the ASEAN Outlook on Indo-Pacific is aimed at upholding the rules-based regional architecture. Yet, we need to have a clearer idea on how ASEAN would do that, because it's not easy. You can't just hope that the regional order will be there and the rules-based. You need to do something. You need strategy. You need a policy, not hope. Second, for the ASEAN Outlook on Indo-Pacific to be meaningful, it requires a platform. The East ASEAN Summit holds a promise to become such a platform. So we should revive national and regional discussions on how the East Asia Summit can be better institutionalized. There have been some ideas out there, of which the CSCAP Memorandum number 26, June 2014, I'm not sure if any from Foreign Ministry here even remember that memorandum. The CSCAP Memorandum remains one of the best proposals so far on how we can utilize the East Asia Summit. And third, ASEAN will not be able to retain its centrality and play a meaningful role in the Indo-Pacific unless it speaks with one voice on how to manage its relations with extra-regional powers. ASEAN should continue its internal reform. Indonesia should revive the idea to evaluate the ASEAN Charter and assess how it can be improved to better equip ASEAN to deal with current and future challenges. So after all, strengthening unity, speaking in one voice, and strong institutional capacity is a key to ASEAN centrality. So we should remember, Indonesia will assume ASEAN championships in 2033. We should think about what legacy that President Jokowi wants to leave behind in ASEAN as he concludes his second term in 2024. And fourth, Indonesia should encourage ASEAN to develop a sharper focus on strengthening a rules-based maritime order. So for example, ASEAN has to improve its capability and role in contributing to good governance at sea. ASEAN needs to build a coalition of UNCLOS defenders, because I'm a bit worried there will be fake UNCLOS. Because some country might reinterpret the UNCLOS. Probably you agree, Pak Hashim, yeah? So we don't need fake UNCLOS, right? So we must strengthen international consensus on the sea as global public goods. And 5, we need to start persuading ASEAN to think outside the box. I know this is hard. ASEAN needs to think about a strategy on how to restrain great powers. You can't just tell, well, we have dialogue. Dialogue is great, but you need more than dialogue these days. So ASEAN should refine and consolidate the soft balancing strategy, a strategy of legitimacy denial. It should ensure that the legitimacy of threatening action by great powers become questionable in the eyes of the international community. But the soft balancing strategy can only be taken through the diplomatic coalition within a regional institutions and also, of course, international institutions. So we need to start thinking about the legitimacy denial strategy. So Indonesia's deep commitment reflects our sense of regional responsibility and obligations to ensure that peace remains the norms and to ensure that sustainable prosperity is possible. So we have no interest in defending Pax Americana in the Indo-Pacific. So we have no appetite to support Pax Sinica either. So our key strategic interest in the region is to maintain ASEAN's strategic autonomy. Our message to all major powers is very clear. Do not turn our regions into an arena for strategic rivalry among yourselves. Join us instead to strengthen the rules-based regional order in an inclusive partnership to fulfill the promise of the ASEAN century. And finally, as for Indonesians, for Indonesia as a country with a deep sense of regional entitlement and a responsible member of international society, it would be very unwise for us to scale down our international activism. Our future, our destiny, and our prosperity is closely linked to the international society. It is with the international community that we must work to deliver the promise of prosperity and stability to our people at home. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Bang Rizal Sukma. I think it's a clear message from the lecture that Indonesia and ASEAN needs to move beyond norm settings and turn into a more kind of a realist view of international relations, given the strategic environment that we are facing. Now, I'd like to open the floor for Q&A. Please be brief and crisp so that we can accommodate more questions. The speaker today is one person, Dr. Rizal Sukma. So those who are asking questions, we are not expecting you to be the speaker when you are asking your question. Please, one on the right side and two on the left. Oh, the second one. All right, and third one. Please identify yourself.
Thank you and good morning. I'm Andre, research assistant to General Agus Wijoyo, Lemhanas Governor. And we're both Chiefning alumni, Pak Rizal. My question is, what is your opinion on the prospect of South China Sea Code of Conduct currently being discussed by ASEAN and China? Do you think ASEAN is strong enough to ensure that the Code of Conduct will be able to protect the principle of ASEAN centrality as well as peace and stability in the South China Sea, free from coercive actions by external powers? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very good example of question. Very short, please.
Thank you. My name is Pandu from Kamlu. Ambassador Rizal, you mentioned about we need to treating the Indian and Pacific Ocean as a single regional architecture. But when we discuss about the outlook on Indo-Pacific, one of the key principles is ASEAN centrality. We sometimes forget about the Indian Ocean part. And for this, from 2015 to 2017, we chaired the Indian Ocean Rim Associations. Do you think we should incorporate IORA in the outlook? And if so, how do we incorporate the IORA in the outlook on Indo-Pacific? Thank you.
Thank you. Next, please.
Good morning, Pak Rizal. My name is Naifa from Parahyangan Catholic University. Following the question towards South China Sea, my question is how the conflict affected Indonesia's position in bridging ASEAN towards Indo-Pacific, and does the Indonesian effort in this aspect affected in the South China Sea? Thank you.
So, 3 questions, I think, for the time being. Enough.
On the South China Sea, even though this is not the topic, it's basically of the lecture. the question is really, is code of conduct enough, right, to preserve peace, stability? Of course not. You don't have to ask that. Of course not, because it's a code, right? Code without the stable balance of power is not going to work. So you have to do both. The code of conduct is important to set up rules, basically, but rules need to be enforced by what? Power. Simple as that, right? So without the power, then rules will be disregarded. As simple as that. What are the power in this sense? There are numbers. Of course, ASEAN doesn't have these physical powers. You can't just accumulate all these military powers of all ASEAN countries and try to face either China or other countries try to preserve peace. No, you can't do that. But there are other form of powers. The use of the institutions can also be regarded as a quite instrumental power that ASEAN has. I talk about the need for ASEAN to build the legitimacy denial strategy. So it's basically how you create, either through the international public opinion or regional public opinion, that will make it anybody who want actually to dominate the regions will face that legitimacy problem. Because I do believe no matter how powerful a country is, at the end they do care about the what is citra? What's English? It's about prestige, it's about good names and so on. So because at the end norms and good names is also define the way a state behave. So the code will help. It's basically to make it clearer for those countries who have claims and non-claimants in the regions regarding what can and cannot be done, right? But in order to ensure, then you need that, either through the institutional arrangement or through degree of balance of power, so that no country would try to upset the security in the regions. So this is basically also, I think, related to the second, the third questions about Indonesia's policy on South China Sea. So I don't think that we can keep telling everybody that we're not claimant, and then so that's why we don't think that we should play a greater role. So we must play a greater role in order to create that balance, to create that legitimacy denial strategy in the regions. IORA and Indo-Pacific. I have problem with those people who thinks that Indo-Pacific is a geographical concept, right? Because if you think the Indo-Pacific is the geographical expressions, then the logical next step in your thinking, how to bring every countries into a meeting, into a forum. So that's the biggest problem that we face in our foreign policy. You think about initiative, the second stage always meeting, forum. It's like Indonesia Africa forum, and then Indonesia Africa dialogue, probably next year Indonesia Africa meeting. It's like forum, dialogue, meeting. So it's we need to get away from that. So I don't think that we need to bring IORA, because Indo-Pacific is just an outlook, the way you look at the world and your place in that world, and then what you are going to do about it. Simple as that. So do not translate the strategic outlook is basically the geopolitical and geoeconomic way of looking at things, then suddenly a regional organization forum. To be frank, I have difficulty in understanding the ASEAN Indo-Pacific outlook, jumping from this great strategic thinking about the changes that we face, how you actually deal with the emerging strategic rivalries among major powers, and suddenly you want to cooperate with Andaman, for example. So it's hard. You just jump with all these the three areas, because we need to show how those areas of cooperations can actually fulfill all those challenges that you identify as the greatest challenge of the time. So that's why you need an outlook in order to structure your policy response later on. So our problem is really moving the hope into policy, moving the expectation into strategy. Yeah, so well, IORA is great. You can have those organizations, and then you can just keep meeting. How many members? With all those countries under on the rim of the Indian Oceans, but that is not the Indo-Pacific idea. You don't have to bring all those countries there into a regional organizations and try to identify agendas for cooperation. So I'm sorry if I disappoint I'm actually disappointing Pandu for that. So I don't think that you need to bring IORA into this kind of strategic thinking that we are still struggling with.
If I may ask, Bang, your response about Indonesia's conduct in all this new strategic setting that you lay out. It seems to me that this under the premise of Indonesia is confident about its power, so Indonesia can selectively engage in areas where we have equal powers. Do you believe that Indonesia does have that power and capacity to shape and to achieve all this realist view of Indonesia's foreign policy in the future? Indonesia is a member of G20, economically speaking, we are quite economically sizable, but there are, I think, other complications about our domestic constraints and so on. So how we mitigate this?
Domestic constraints were also great in 1970s, in 1980s, and also during Pak Dino's say terms, from Pak Yudhoyono 2004 to 2014. Domestic constraints were always there. Yet, I think Indonesia has always been able to find, a space, for itself, to play a meaningful and also, I think useful, foreign policy role. So, in fact, the pressure, to do more now is actually greater compared to even 10 years ago, because of all the changes now are becoming clearer and clearer that, we are witnessing the return of great power politics. And then, we learned, during the Cold War era, that ASEAN managed actually to navigate that, difficult, terrain at the time. So I don't see why now, we cannot continue to be, active, in the international arena. But one main difference that I would like to emphasize, Pak Dino just went straight to the world, to the UN, international, But I think now we should really, focus more on the Indo-Pacific, because this is where the future of the world, will be decided. So instead of, well, disarmament, arms control in the UN is great. UN Security Council is beautiful, but, please lah. So I think, here, we have more resources, we need more attention, to, our own regions, which already expanded, from only East Asia, into the Indo-Pacific. So that's already, I think, like 2/3 of world, problems, basically, within that geopolitical and geoeconomic space. So if we can focus there, but again, I don't believe that we can do it alone. So I still believe that ASEAN is very critical, for that, because once ASEAN is divided, once ASEAN can no longer preserve its unity, then, finito lah, we finished.
Thank you. Any more questions? 1 and 2, and the other side. I'll give the chance to you later. And please.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Sukma and Pa Fermonte. So let's be short. Very interesting, but I'm a bit puzzled. The motto of Indo-Pacific, as it has been presented by Indonesia, I know, reflected in ASEAN, and you mentioned that, it's inclusiveness from rim to rim, connecting the connectivities. You said that you are not interested into a particular American or Chinese or Japanese vision, but still you want to connect the connectivities, i.e. BRI, the Japanese, the American concept of Indo-Pacific, they have their own concept, and also other connectivity initiatives in connecting the connectivities. We have the EU-Asia connectivity strategies, where we offer the fully interconnected Europe to be connected with Asia or Indo-Pacific. So how do you reconcile those inclusiveness principles and this connecting the connectivities principle with your ASEAN centrality and with, you said, the need to operationalize a platform through institutionalizing EIS. You said that EIS has to develop its institutional capacities. Whilst at the same time, you have been clear when we were discussing IORA that it's not about having a United Nations BIS with as many name tags in the discussion as there are countries in the region and partners, and of course thinking about European partners, given the trade and investment links and the connectivity that we want to achieve with the region. So how do you reconcile this call to a platform, institutionalized platform, EIS, where you will have Russia on board, for instance, whilst you will not have anybody from the Central and South American, western coast of America, and nobody from the Indian Ocean or the African Eastern coast. Do you have some clarity about this setup? Thank you.
Thank you. Please, next.
I'm the Sri Lankan ambassador here in Jakarta, and I also will be representing Sri Lanka at ASEAN. Thank you for your interesting presentation, Excellency. My question is, in the context of this new Indian Ocean outreach, how soon is ASEAN going to start engaging the South Asian states? Sri Lanka, for instance, has put forward its application as an SDP partner. And technically, of course, we may be even a dialogue partner in the new context that might be more relevant. I would be interested in understanding, now that ASEAN is no longer looking purely at the Pacific, but the Indian Ocean as well, what is the South Asia strategy of ASEAN as well as big states of ASEAN such as Indonesia? Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. The third one, please.
Thank you for your presentation and the opportunity. My name is Habib from CSIS. So basically, I'm quite interested, sir, with your speech in regards to legitimacy denial strategy. So when you said about legitimacy denial strategy, you mentioned about how do we carry attempts to make like great powers becomes questionable. However, at the same time, you also propose like how if ASEAN uses the East Asia Summit to be our main platform to engage like Indo-Pacific countries. While at the same time, we know that East Asia Summit is actually quite limited to great powers, like in terms of the membership itself. And then my question is, could you please elaborate more on the legitimacy denial strategy, and also how do we engage like partners in the EAS in the future? Thank you.
On the inclusive, elements, of the Indo-Pacific, the ASEAN Outlook Indo-Pacific, is basically it's very simple. We all know, because the competing, Indo-Pacific ideas, it's all exclude China. Simple as that. You read the Japanese version, you read the American versions, you read also the Indian versions. Implicit, in that is actually doesn't include China. So ASEAN is not comfortable with that. So the inclusivity in that context, actually how to bring, China is a big giant, into the entire, this new, space of engagement, if you like. So we should not exclude anybody. So that's a very ASEAN way, in a way. The connectivity, if you look at the areas of cooperation, it's basically more like physical connectivity they talk about, but of course internet, and all those digital, connectivity is also, it's also mentioned. Is not a way, to connect the whole world. I don't think that, ASEAN Outlook of, on Indo-Pacific actually wants to do that as well. Of course, we want to engage like either EU and other, extra regional powers as well. But it doesn't have to be, within the same platform. So, I envision, for example, the EU and EAS, once the EAS, become the premier platform, for the Indo-Pacific cooperations, can be achieved, then, the EAS and EU partnership, can be one form on how you connect the Indo-Pacific with the rest of the world. So I'm sorry to say, it's private, opinion. I'm one of those, who basically against the EU become a member of the EAS until and unless ASEAN become full-fledged member of the EU. So, you know, that sort of partnership is better. EAS or ASEAN EU or EAS EU, rather than bringing EU, you know, as a member of the East Asia, East Asia Summit. So I don't see any contradictions, you know, there. You know, because, you know, when we talk about Indo-Pacific as geopolitical and geoeconomic, you know, unit, you know, in our strategic thinking, is basically, you know, to talk about what is the key areas of priority in terms of the challenges, in terms of the interest that we face now and the next probably, you know, 15 to 20 years. So that's, you know, I think, you know, what we try, you know, to deliver, you know, when Indonesia together with ASEAN also come up with its own voice, you know, when it comes to what sort of future that, you know, we want to see, you know, in the Indo-Pacific, you know, region. This is basically what Outlook is all about. This is what, you know, a vision is all about. So again, like I mentioned earlier, the hardest part is basically what are you going to do with it? You know, you have the Outlook, and then, you know, what are the institutions that you need to set up? What are, you know, the key areas of cooperation that you need to focus on? And then what are the regional institutional capacity that you need to develop so that, you know, this vision, this outlook, you know, can be a reality. And then the ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific are very clear on what sort of things that they want: inclusive, everybody nice to each other, you know, and then you don't go to war, you know, and then you cooperate, and so on and so on. But the key objective is basically to manage, you know, the growing rivalry between China and the US. As simple as that, you know. So that's why, you know, I mentioned, although we're not sure that we want to defend the Pax Americana, but, you know, we also don't want Pax Sinica. Of course, we want Pax ASEAN, but it's not possible, you know. So, you know, only within the Southeast Asia probably, you know, can. So this is, you know, what the Indo-Pacific idea, you know, is all about. And again, I don't see the point, you know, why do you need to bring all those, you know, American countries, you know, into the Indo-Pacific? Because Indo-Pacific is not an organization. So it's like, it's the same case, you know, with IORA, you know. So you don't need to create the association of the Indo-Pacific corporations and then come up with the treaty of amity and cooperation Indo-Pacific. I don't believe in those. You know, so, you know, it's better, you know, I mean, to be frank, if you look at, you know, all these major powers, you know, so these are, you know, the challenge, you know, that we face. So who that ASEAN need to engage is really depend on the interest, you know, that, you know, ASEAN want to achieve, you know, within the regions, within that, you know, the Indo-Pacific, you know, context as geopolitical and geoeconomic entity. But of course, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, you know, I think are important players, you know, in that part of the world. But the key now again is not actually bringing all these countries, including India, you know, into a new regional organization. It's basically, you know, how we can create a common platform where we all believe that the sea is public good. We need to work together to defend the UNCLOS, you know, and then we realize that we need to tame great powers in these two oceans, you know, because next 10 years, you know, the rivalry, you know, among these major powers, you know, will be shifting, you know, from the landscape, you know, of the mainland, you know, Southeast Asia or mainland South Asia into the seascape, you know, of the Indian, you know, oceans and also the Pacific Ocean, which include, of course, you know, the South China Sea. Final questions on the denial legitimacy. Denial legitimacy can only be applied if you combine three things. One, norms. Second, institutions. And third, balance of power. So without, you know, these three, but balance of power, I don't think that ASEAN, you know, can play a role, you know, in shaping this balance of power. But balance of powers are only among the great powers. You know, in a way, our region already has that, you know, the balance of power, you know, among the US, China, you have India, Japan, and then the second layers, you know, you have these middle powers like Indonesia, Australia, South Korea, and so on. So a degree, you know, I mean, a degree of stable balance of power is already there, you know, in the Indo-Pacific, you know, regions. But, you know, once this balance of power shifting, then, you know, you need to address the potential negative implication of those shifts, you know, through norms and institutions. So, it's, you know, to put it in a simple way, strategy, legitimacy denial strategy is a strategy to threatening behavior of major powers questionable through a diplomatic coalitions within regional institutions. So EES is the only, I think, a possible platform, for that. So because I don't think that you can do this legitimacy denial within ASEAN. But of course, other ASEAN countries can do that against us. So that's a good example. So we behave, because we know, that our legitimacy in our behavior can be questioned, if we behave badly again. So that's, I think, an example of the legitimacy denial that is carried out by lesser powers or smaller powers within the, regional institutional framework. Then, as we look at the Indo-Pacific regions, the EES is a logical, platform, where ASEAN countries, can actually apply or exercise the legitimacy denial strategy.
All right. We still have some time for Q&A. Now there are more questions on the other side. Bapak, the second row, and Ibu as well, and the one at the back, and Masnya. So I'll take all questions now. It's already 4, and the one on the left. And again, please introduce yourself and please be brief. Silakan, Pak.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Viramal Anjaya. I am from the Jakarta Post newspaper. We have been talking about ASEAN unity, centrality for so many years. Now we have become a community, but still we have so many problems. We are not united. Even we don't have solidarity. What's happening in the now South China Sea, what's happening in the Philippines, what's happening in the Vietnam, what's happening in the Malaysian waters, what's happening in our own Natuna waters. We don't have any solidarity. So my question is very simple. How can we achieve ASEAN unity? What Indonesia can do, whether we change, the ASEAN decision-making process, or we have to impose like a sanctions mechanism on some of our members, because some of our ASEAN members are not working in the interest of ASEAN, because they are working for outside powers. Thank you. Yeah.
Please, second one.
Thank you. My name is Elena. I'm from Brains and Partners. Following up on this gentleman's question before, so my question is also very similar. You emphasized before the importance of transforming norm building into more like practical, actionable. But what is actually the prospect of ASEAN member countries to actually do that? Do we have like enough political willpower, or even do we have like even like the same interest to actually move on from the norm building into more actionable? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, H.E Ambassador. My name is Victor. I just want to ask what your thought about Belt and Road Initiative, given the fact that one country is pouring a huge amount of money in the region, and also one country has leased their land for many years. And second one is when it comes to drug smuggler, I think it's also imperative, because Indonesia doesn't preserve or protect our water, given the fact drug smuggler always been caught by our national police. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. First of all, thank you very much for your comprehensive presentation earlier. My name is Bagus, and I'm from the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. My question is that earlier you said something about giving clarity to the Asian member states about the outlook even more, and also regarding upholding the rules-based principles enshrined in the outlook. My question is that, is it time for ASEAN to have its own regional court in order to uphold those principles of the outlook? Thank you. The question is that, is it time for ASEAN to have its own court, a regional court, in order to uphold those rules-based principles? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity, Bapak Philip. My name is Iqbal from Universitas Pajajaran. In the regional security complex, it's explained that there are 3 behavioral transformations, and one of them is the internal transformations. As Bapak Rizal Sukma said before, the implementations of the ASEAN autonomy to drive the region is really matter. But my question is how ASEAN as an umbrella organization can handle an internal transformations, for example, like Cambodia balancing to China, or Philippines balancing to China, or Vietnam balancing to United States in context to ASEAN Outlook on Indo-Pacific. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So there are 5. Enough on the plate, Bob.
And all the questions. What does Indonesia can do? What does Indonesia do to uphold unity? I think we need to start thinking about how we preserve centrality without unity. Because we keep thinking that centrality is possible only if we have unity. So I think we need to move beyond that. So we need to start thinking about how ASEAN can preserve its centrality without unity. Because I mean, it's quite obvious that some interests overlap, some interests basically, of course, differ. So you can't have 10 countries with exactly the same interests all the time. So within that context, there are certain issues where we, I think, agree that ASEAN should have common positions. One of those areas is that I don't think that any ASEAN member state would disagree if we say that we need to preserve Southeast Asia strategic autonomy. So I think we all agree that no extra-regional power can dominate the regions. So that's very clear. So I think all the 10 agree with that. Even the major powers agree with that. So because even though they want to, they know they can't to dominate the region. So on that core strategic interest, we all I think agree. Of course, we differ with regard to how are you going to achieve that. So within that context, ASEAN has been trying its best. So since 1967, we are, I think, one of the greatest players when it comes to how you navigate this extra regional powers quest for influence. But today, I think, like I mentioned, we need to look at the ASEAN Charter again. There are some areas that can still be improved. Because when we agreed to the ASEAN Charter during Pak Hassan at the time, ASEAN promised a lot of things. Also for Indonesia. After 5 years, they agreed to evaluate, and then to open up the discussion again and so on. So, but now, what, 11 years since we agreed with the ASEAN Charter, nobody took the initiative to evaluate the ASEAN Charter, including the decision-making process, the institutions that we have, and other arrangement within the Charter. So I think Indonesia should take the lead, in actually looking at the ASEAN Charter again, and then see, where we need to do some improvements, in order to preserve the 3 key, I think, important elements, for ASEAN cooperation, which include, of course, the unity. I do not advocate, that we move from norms, to power. So it's actually what I said, we need to combine norms with power. So that's the key, I think it's a simple IR 101, so because you need, I mean, let me go back, I think the one who asked this question is also IR student, right? Let me go back to the 3 men, thinking in IR, the Grotius, Kant, right? So it's actually, and then Hobbes. Then you can actually combine the 3. This is what we have in the region. Either East Asia or the Indo-Pacific is unique. This is the regions where the 3 types of order exist. One's the realist order. This is, the balance of power, US, China, and also, of course, Japan and all these countries. The realist order exists. And then also you have the institutional order. ASEAN, we believe that institutions are important, so that's why we set up, ASEAN, and institution can define the way state behave, and so on and so on. The third order, the normative order. This is what we love the most. Rules, norms, because it's hard, right, to do number 1, number 2. Number 3 is easy, right? But these 3 layers of orders interact very nicely with each other, within the Indo-Pacific regions. So that's why, I think we must keep working at these 3 layers of orders that exist, in Indo-Pacific. Now we need to continue with this norm-setting exercise. We need also, to focus on enhancing the institutions that we have. In this context is the East Asia Summit, and of course, we also, need, to pay attention to how the balance of powers, is shifting, in the regions. BRI, I think it's a great idea as long as it is about economy and diplomacy and not about hegemony. Simple. This is one of those questions that's very difficult as a government official to answer. So, you should ask Bang Rene later to answer a question about the BRI. But as a government official, this is what I can say. BRI is a great idea as long as it is about economy and diplomacy, but not about hegemony. So that's, I think the bottom line, that, we need to work with, when we come to how that we can relate to the Chinese BRI. Courts, I'm not sure what court that you're referring to. Because when we talk about regional or rules-based regional order or rules-based international order, it's not about then, which country or what court that can enforce that rules-based international order. But it's basically, this is the code word. When you use the word like rules-based international order, basically we are referring to the international order that's been set up by the US in 1945. And it includes the Bretton Woods institutions, all those human rights principles, and so on, which is being dismantled by Americans themselves at the moment. So within East Asia or the Indo-Pacific, I think there are, of course, needs. We call it, what is it in the TAC? The High Council. So we do have, certain institutions, but we never use it. But when it comes to court, I still one of those, who believe that, we need to continue, to use the international, institutions that we have. The International Court of Justice is there, and then, I think UNCLOS also provide a number, of institutions that we can use, when it comes to the needs to preserve the maritime-related issues. So I don't think that ASEAN should, set up a new maritime court, in order to enforce whatever we think, should be enforced, within too much hassle. Just use whatever we have at the international level, and as long as we can agree that it is our obligation now to actually defend UNCLOS. So because these days I don't see many people in Indonesia anymore, except probably Pak Asim Jalal, Pak Dino, who keep, and Hafaz probably, who keep telling everyone, never forget and never, waver, in defending, UNCLOS. This is the only things that the world, has when it comes to dealing with the changes that we are facing, which is, I think, the move of this rivalry from the landscape, to the seascape of the Indo-Pacific. Now, without UNCLOS, then we go back, to this rough, power politics. So, I think my appeal to my colleagues at the Foreign Ministry, I think, you need, to allocate more resources and also more attention, to the maritime issues, including, of course, the maritime rules and how to create, a good order at sea, and so on. So this has been lacking over the last, because, I think when I was in high school, Pak, and then, entered Pajajaran University, Pak Hashim, you are a legend already, when you talk about the international law of the sea. Now I almost retired, and then the legend is still Pak Hashim Jalal when it comes to the international law of the sea. Now we need more Pak Hashim Jalal, So Padino has moved to diaspora and other issues. So we need somebody to actually carry on the torch of Indonesia as a country that really played a very great role in 1982 adoptions of the UNCLOS. So without defending UNCLOS, it's useless to talk about the Indo-Pacific, to talk about Indonesia as a power between two oceans, and so on. The final how to achieve strategic autonomy of ASEAN. It's difficult, of course. Again, number one, that ASEAN has always been, I think, good at, to create this engagement among themselves, and then remind everyone, even though certain member state, has a certain characteristic of relationship with certain extra-regional powers, but at the end, everything that we do still within the framework of preserving this ASEAN integrity, as the regional organizations. That's very clear. Only one occasion in the history of ASEAN we failed to do that in 2013, I think, then when we failed to agree on the ASEAN communique. But fortunately at the time, Indonesia, Pak Marty managed to take initiative in order to bring ASEAN together again on critical issues in the regions. Number two, I think it's no longer enough for let me put it this way, compared to say 20 years ago. This is also, I think, there's something new within ASEAN. In the past, the network among the officials, the head of state, head of governments, foreign ministers, I think it's very intensive. So they know each other because they were there almost forever, so some 20 years, some 25 years. But now it's changing. So I think, it's unrealistic to expect the head of government to have that level of personal relationship within ASEAN. But we need to go to level below. So the foreign ministries network, I think, critical, among the ASEAN member states. So we need, to actually find ways or create some programs that can make it possible, for foreign ministry officials and defense ministry officials, probably echelon 2, 3, 2 or 3, to actually know their peers, in every ASEAN member state. I'm not sure how extensive that network, at the moment, but of course those who serve in the Indonesian embassies in the ASEAN countries will have that, but not necessarily outside the ASEAN member states. So I think program that Pak Dino initiate, is actually helpful, in bringing and creating that kind of networks, because leaders now come and go. Pak Jokowi can only be in the power for 10 years, and some other countries probably even shorter. Some have a coup, 2 years, 3 years. So not like in the past. So if you want actually to handle these internal differences, that's what we have we have to do. Otherwise, it would be very difficult if you only rely on. Yes, we have 1,412 meetings now per year as ASEAN, but all of those is basically technical meeting. But you can't rely on only EMM or only on the ASEAN summit, to actually try to create. So we need more discussion within ASEAN, about all these strategic issues, about the challenges that that we face. Otherwise, it's very hard, to actually maintain that core strategic interest of ASEAN.
Thank you, Bang Rizal. We still have room for 1 or 2 more questions, if there are any. If there is any. None? Sure, Pak Dino, please. The microphone.
I just speak loudly. I don't need a microphone.
Okay.
I just want first a great presentation. Personal question. You are one of the few people who knows President Jokowi very well since the campaign and so different than it was 5 years ago. So I thought it would be very interesting to get your take on that.
Just before you answer the question, it's live stream.
I don't think that it's very different, from 5 years ago, because I think Pak Jokowi still focus on how we can actually, how the foreign policy at the end contribute, to the domestic development agenda, right? So that is very clear, and then I think he will continue that, and continue that kind of line of thinking. So in a way, still foreign policy begins at home, and foreign policy should basically benefit, the national priorities, and that is basically, every country is like that. What will be different? I think there would be less constraints now, for Indonesia to play a greater activism, in our international role. And in fact, we need to step up our international role, because all these domestic agendas that we have now cannot be achieved unless we work very closely with the international community. That's very clear. So especially if you want to move the capital, you need more capital to build the capital. Then only international community can help you to find those capital that you need. And of course, the attentions to diplomatic economy, attentions to the foreign economic relation will be greater, because I think we all are familiar with the criticisms of Pak Jokowi, especially after the huge trade deficit, in 2018. So we need to focus more on those area as well. The third area that will be, I think, different as well. At least, I think Pak Jokowi, once everything's in place, cabinet is in place, and then all the directions or guidelines for the next 5 years in place, then I think he will also start to think about international legacy that he needs to leave behind. That require, of course, a greater involvement in a foreign policy initiative of Indonesia.
Thank you. I think we've reached the end of the public lecture. If I may also respond to Pak Dino's question, then I think the answer would be, we need, with all this thinking that Ambassador Rizal put forward before us, we basically need more solid foreign minister. And I think it's a very clear message from the paper. By the way, you will all get the papers outside for you to refer. But I think it's a great strategic thinking in the making. And somehow I feel like Ambassador Rizal also talked to IR department of CSIS to continue doing research and thinking on so many aspects that Ambassador Rizal put forward in this paper. And thirdly, I'd like to thank you all for coming and for the great discussions on our foreign policy for some years to come. I hope we all be contributing to this endeavor for Indonesia to maintain leadership, quote unquote, in ASEAN, and then to maintain our strategic autonomy in light of the strategic rivalry between the two great superpowers. Ambassador Rizal mentioned about this Thucydides, my favorite quote of the week: suffer what they must, the strong do what they can. I think we have to change this into the weak should not suffer what they must, the strong should not do what they always want to do. And that, I think the answer lies on some tenets that Ambassador Rizal put forward, that we need to strengthen and institutionalize ASEAN in order to refrain these great power. And I'd like the conceptual proposals of the strategic denial, strategic legitimacy, denial of strategic legitimacy. Is that correct? That I think then diplomacy is the way out. for us to continue engaging the great powers without suffering, from their excessive behavior in our part of the world. Thank you all for coming, and we have a saying at CSIS that those who are having the ideas should be the one who implement. So we don't mind if Pak Rizal then will be the one who implement all this great strategic thinking. Thank you very much.
Saya pikir masih di Hongkong.